Out of here. Hey, Jeff.
But I think it's not accurate. All right. Well, thank you very much. So for those of you who had like some negative emotional experience because of the little technical glitches, kind of ironic since the class is this particular lecture will be about the importance of having mildly positive emotions for your success at negotiation and otherwise. My name is Clark Freshman, and so I'm a professor of law here at the University of California, College of Law, San Francisco, formerly known as UC. And I'd like to welcome all of you here. We're here in person as well as online for our UC Law Center for Negotiation and Resolution lecture and discussion series. So I have been a professor here since 2007, and previously was a professor full-time as well at the University of Miami, which is where a lot of this research was done with our psychology department over there. And my own research tends to focus on the intersection of emotional awareness, emotional skills, including mindfulness, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which we'll touch on today, as well as recognition of emotion in others, including recognition of emotion as one way to tell whether people are being truthful or in line. So I'll focus today on one of 3 studies that I did at the University of Miami and continue to follow up on. And that's about why it will be efficient to pay attention to even mild changes in emotion. So let me give you a little bit of a breakdown. So a little roadmap of what we'll be doing today. So first, a little bit of what might be called theory, but really it's kind of just a framework for thinking about what is the role of emotion in negotiation. And I'll explain like how we might test that out. And then I'll describe this negotiation study that we did to test out what are the effects of mild changes in emotion for people's success at negotiation. And success is just getting more of what people want for their clients or for themselves. Then I'll talk about the implications relatively narrowly for negotiation, and then somewhat more broadly for negotiation education, both short-term and long-term. And then we'll look at broader implications of this research for 4 kinds of crises that are going on in the United States and around the world today. One is negotiation failure, the inefficiency of negotiation. Second is the diversity performance gap. So that means that some people, in particular, as it's been studied in the US at least, Blacks and or women do worse in negotiation, as well as others, such as those who are same-sex couples getting mortgage rates. Diversity in admissions to law schools and elsewhere, and the mental health crisis, including depression, anxiety, substance abuse amongst lawyers and lawsuits. And then lastly, so just preview and just relate this to some other research on how emotion affects success in law school and in terms of emotional habits, mental health. That's kind of the agenda for today. So first, I want to sort of define what emotional efficiency is compared to the usual view. So if I were to ask people, what's the effect of emotion on negotiation, which I've done for like 20 or 30 years, you have people just to write it down, pop it out. Usually this is what would happen. People would talk exclusively about negative emotion, in particular anger. You're shaking your head slightly. You wouldn't talk about that?
No.
Oh, no,
I agree. But the positive side is super.
Yeah, the positive side, right. So most people, well, that's the next slide, right? That's fantastic. So most people talk about negative emotion, especially anger. And the same thing if you looked at most law school textbooks and popular negotiation books, you would find that it talks about emotion almost exclusively in terms of negative emotion and in particular anger. Second, people look at emotion in terms of it being strong and intense. And third, people talk about this, about being emotion from difficult people or difficult clients. And I'll mention that when people discuss this, often the difficult clients or difficult people, this is infected by the kind of implicit bias that is very common in society, such as thinking that women who are assertive are being difficult, or that people who are from certain hot cultures or hot religions, such as Latin cultures or people who are Jewish, will be perceived as being more difficult than others. So the typical advice from this usual view of emotion and negotiation is that the lawyer or the mediator at jams or at the court should cool out the hot emotion, especially of difficult people. Otherwise, there's not some really big emotion going on by these difficult people, then let's just get to business. We don't need to pay attention to emotion at all. So that is, if we were to survey, as I do in the paper, lots of the popular books, as well as academic books and academic studies, that's what most people focus on in terms of emotion. Now, the view that I have, and my colleagues have helped me develop this, are about efficient emotion. What that means is, compared to other things that you could do with your life and in your negotiations, it would be efficient for you to spend more time and resources paying attention to emotion. That would affect the bottom line. So that's one part. Emotion cannot just be something that's negative, but as you mentioned here, it can also be positive, such as joy or happiness or enthusiasm or contentment. Second, mild emotions matter. Mild emotions matter. And so I'll talk about in a minute. Decades of research show that. So in lots of different studies, if you have people negotiating in a business school, and some of them, when they're negotiating, little do they know, there's Glade air freshener in there. It gives me a mild headache, but apparently makes most people mildly happier. They get better results. Down on the peninsula, about 45 minutes from now, 45 minutes from here, if you were at Stanford Business School, they did a study where people saw a funny video, and then other people saw a video that was not so funny. Just 5 minutes. The people who saw the funny video did better, both for themselves and in terms of expanding the pie in Hollywood-style negotiation. So very mild emotions make a difference. And then it's not just for difficult people. These are studies not just of undergraduate students, business school students, but super successful, top of their game, academic physicians at Columbia Medical School. So here's a little take-home thing. So if any of you are going to the doctor anytime soon, like to follow up on an ankle injury, for example, what you should do is bring chocolate for your doctor. Because as it turns out, the doctors at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, who are attending physicians, the doctors got a little bit of chocolate before they were asked to review a file and diagnose it. They were faster and more accurate than the doctors who did not get chocolate. So the point here is that just very mild changes in emotion have been shown in lots of studies to improve not just negotiation results, but practically anything other than rote thinking, and for normal people. Thus, the advice that I would give that comes from the research is to cultivate positive emotion, to actually cultivate positive emotion, and to develop what I'll call emotionally efficient habits, such as a certain kind of optimism, and to reduce negative emotion. That's the basic thesis. There are some limits to the research that I tried to address in the study that I did. So what we know is that the bottom line in a number of studies is that positive emotion increases the bottom line and negative emotion decreases it. How does that happen? It hasn't been looked at as closely, but in studies that have looked at it, we know that when people are in a bad mood, they don't understand what other people want. So people get negotiation instructions on one side, negotiation instructions on the other. The people who are in a bad mood in the study at the Harvard Kennedy School, observed public servants, the people who are put in a bad mood and were more angry, very mildly, they were incredibly less accurate at knowing what the other side wanted compared to the other people. That's one method. We also know that when people in general are in a negative mood, they're more likely to lie and they're less likely to keep their commitments. And that was found in the negotiation study done in Australia. Here's one of the limits, and there are a couple of them. So what these studies all involved was different ways of manipulating mood through scent, through candy, through positive feedback. So the limit to that is that won't necessarily work all the time for everyone. So people might not be able to give themselves chocolate necessarily. They might not be able to give themselves false positive feedback, excuse me, about how well they're doing. So that's one of the limits. So what we looked at was naturally occurring mood instead. And the second limitation was that in all of these studies, it was just one mood manipulation. So we couldn't really tell, does positive mood matter or is it just the reduction in negative mood? So in other words, on an everyday basis, is the usual view of negotiation correct? That if you're not feeling bad, you don't have to pay attention to emotion? Or is it that even if you're not feeling bad, putting yourself in a positive mood, having positive emotion would be better? So the existing studies don't really show that. Lastly, none of the studies that I know of looked at lawyers or law students. And here's why this matters. In other research, lawyers and law students are actually quite distinct from the rest of the population. So one example is a certain measure of optimism. I used a different measure in our studies, but the usual measure of optimism is, are things going to work out okay? And tons of people have gotten tenure, academic grants, and traveled around the world studying lots of different people in psychology schools, in art schools, in anthropology schools, undergraduate, graduate, medical school, all these different countries. All of the studies said the same thing. People who think that things are going to work out for the best, they get better grades. Isn't that amazing? And then someone thought, well, we might as well try it in law schools, and wrong. It turns out people who are negative in their first year of law school, who think that things are not going to work out okay, they'll be more depressed and anxious than their peers, but they'll get better grades. And so that gave me some pause to think, wait, maybe things are different for law students. Maybe for law students, it's not so great to be in a positive mood. Right, so that was one reason why. The other reason why is that we know from some research that although nearly everyone is affected by emotion, two sets of people are not when it comes to negotiation. People who at one extreme are highly Machiavellian. And there's actually an index for this that someone developed decades ago. And Machiavellianism, for purposes of psychological research, means that you think that the ends justify the means, and that lying is okay and manipulation is okay. Ponder this question: which profession has the highest degree of Machiavellianism? Just think to yourself what that might be, and I'll tell you the answer. The answer is psychiatrists, off the chart. So the next time that you go to a psychiatrist, do not trust that person across the room. They're highly Machiavellian. Right, so that's one thing that we know. At the other extreme, there are thought to be 5 big variables. After decades of research into personality, most people agree that we're all basically the same. Put us in the same situation, we'll behave the same way. So again, down at Stanford, they did the Stanford prison experiment and thought, what if we just classify some students as good and other students as guards? People were randomized into one role or the other. It turned out the people who were given the role of being guards started acting really mean to the people who were prisoners, thus proving the general point that in general, we all act the same under the same conditions. There are 5 differences, and one of them is agreeableness. You don't find many agreeable people in law school, but you do find a lot of agreeable people in nursing school and therapy school, so counseling school, but not psychiatry residence programs where people are not agreeable. So agreeable people are always cooperative. Machiavellian people are always competitive, regardless of the mood manipulation. So I thought maybe that's going to make a difference for law school. All right, so here's how we did the study. So we looked at law students who were in my class at the University of Miami. We gave them a scorable real estate set. And by the way, this is like a little stylized, but this is the way that research is generally done in a quantitative sense at business schools and at psychology schools. There's quite a bit less quantitative research in law schools themselves. And so what happens was there are 4 issues, as there are in lots of studies, success at negotiation, and people got a certain number of points depending on how much they sold it for, when they would close, what the interest rate was, and I forget what the fourth point was. The incentive was partly that their outcome would be part of their grade in my class, and also the people who scored the most points would get some medium amount of financial incentive. Right? So that was the way we looked at success. And then we looked at 2 different sets of mood measures. One was optimism in a distinct sense. Optimism at the beginning of the semester, which was the idea not that things will turn out okay, but that you can overcome obstacles, And my colleague at University of Miami, Charlie Carver, in the psychology department there, he developed this and showed that this particular measure was associated with which people, such as my sister, who is attending virtually today, would survive cancer. So my sister actually is 20 or 21 years out of having had stage 3, I believe C, she thinks B, ovarian cancer. And she's in the 20% that survived beyond 5 years. And the whole time that she was getting treated, she thought, well, if somebody is going to survive, if it's like 20%, why not me? And so she thought that she could overcome obstacles. So that was the measure that we used, optimism in the scale, beginning of the semester. And by the way, this kind of optimism turns out to be something that can be taught. And we also looked at mild mood right before the negotiation. We gave people a list of 20 words and how much they agreed with them. 10 of them were positive, like happy, enthusiastic, calm. Half of them are negative, like angry, sad, despondent, discouraged. So we got from that 2 independent scores, positive emotion right before, the negative emotion right before. And now we get to what the results were. So in many of the studies, people who were put in a positive or negative mood, it affected not just their individual gains, how much they got for themselves, but also how much they made the pie bigger. So at the Stanford study, people who saw the funny video, they got more points for themselves, but the collective points of them and the other side were actually bigger as well. They saw where there were certain synergies, and so on. We didn't actually find that in our study. What we found was there was no effect on joint gains, so it didn't affect how much the pie was made bigger. But those who said they had more positive mood did better for themselves, their client. Those who said they had more negative mood did worse for themselves and their client. Right, so what did we get from that? Key innovation number 1, because we tested positive and negative emotion differently, we were able to test, is it a single scale? Just are you in a good mood or not? Or is it 2 different things? Turns out they're independently significant. And so the way we did this statistically was to look at, well, how much is there an association between positive mood and the outcome, negative mood and the outcome? Well, what if we add them in together? Does that do better? And the answer is yes. So that's the first point. Positive and negative emotion independently matter. Second, as you'll see in the stats slide coming up next, there are relatively small differences in emotion. So it didn't have to be something intense from difficult people. The other thing we found out is that for law students, emotion affects the results in similar ways. So similar positive emotion better, negative emotion worse. Optimism had not been studied in other studies, so that was something we discovered that was new. And those are the main new findings you see on this slide. Here's just a little bit of, for those of you who'd like to geek out on the statistics, what we found. So I'll show you a little bit here. So positive mood, this is a 0.31 association with individual gains. That's fantastic. So in terms of admission to law school, for example, the LSAT typically is like the best thing statistically that can predict success in law school. The study we look at later, optimism actually does really quite well. But it only gets about a 0.2 correlation. So this is really quite good. So the more positive mood, the better individual gain. We see that here. Actually no effect at all on joint gains. And the positive mood on a scale from 1 to 5, this is the standard deviation. So that captures quite a bit of the spread. That was actually not that big of a spread. Negative mood, worse individual gains, something of an effect on joint gains, although that was not statistically significant, which is what these little asterisks do. A bit more of a spread on the negative mood, and you'll see that people actually had more of a negative mood than a positive mood. Then we'll drop down to optimism. And here you see, just at the beginning of the semester, kind of amazing, not right before the negotiation, this dispositional optimism that people can overcome obstacles like the sister has. The more that people had that, the more it was associated with individual gains, and here as well, also with joint gains. So optimism, from a societal point of view, is actually even more important to develop than this positive emotion. So those are the statistics, and I'll skip over some of the other more complicated measurements we took. So now what are the implications? So I'm very interested in the Q&A, also in learning from you what you think the implications are for negotiation. So the first is, we should be aware of what our emotion is before an interaction. And then we have two options. We can try to build the positive emotion. Maybe we have chocolate, maybe we learn a certain type of meditation, maybe we take a walk around the block, whatever it might be for you. We try to reduce the negative emotion in ourselves, whatever way would work for you. An alternative is to correct for the effects of emotion, to correct for it. So one example of correcting for it would be delay it, right? So you might decide you're about to go into a mediation, you're feeling some negative emotion. One of my students right before, when we did a meditation before class, he said, it was kind of hard to meditate because I'd just gotten this bad email. And it took a while for that to go out of his system. So if that were you, and you're about to go into a negotiation over your lease or talk to an opposing counsel, it might be the way you correct for it is you actually just reschedule it. Implications for medium term in terms of education. What you see here is candy. This is one of my favorite lessons, which is that even though there are some things that make most people happy, like Glade air freshener, where there's a particular type of Mozart music, Eine Kleine is something that makes most people happy, that my sister considers to be funeral music. By the way, if you have a bingo card at home where you're marking each time I mention my sister or drinking game, you should not be driving at this point because I've mentioned her so much. So the candy lesson is that for any given person, even though most people like chocolate, some people like dark chocolate, some people like milk chocolate. I really like dark chocolate with dried blood oranges in it, which is kind of hard to get. If anyone in the audience got it for me as a gift, I really appreciate it. And if you're at home wondering how you can thank me for your continuing legal education credits, just get chocolate with dried blood oranges and ship it to me here at the law school. That would be great. So the idea is that we want people to learn what works for them, to put them in more of a positive mood and less of a negative mood. So I'm going to say that for years, since 1999 actually, I followed a lot of the research and evidence-based approaches. And so I taught in my classes different types of mindfulness. So mindfulness is the idea that you focus on the present moment and that you notice how it changes over time, that you do it intentionally, intending to pay attention to the present moment. I've switched from that to a paradigm which is mindful self-compassion. The words are a little bit undescriptive of what the techniques are. The big difference is mindfulness required very long meditations, typically in research 45 minutes. Now it's been scaled down to maybe 25 minutes. It's not very scalable in terms of the number of people who will actually do that. Mindful self-compassion approaches, on the other hand, which have been studied by psychology professors, which I teach in classes, they can either be very short meditations, as short as 5 minutes, or even non-meditations at all, such as journaling or certain reflections. So that fits with the candy lessons. We want to learn, how can we teach people to be aware of their emotions? How will they shift them apropos of the candy lesson? What works for them? And then because other emotions, the emotions of others matter, that it's useful to figure out how can we become aware of the emotions of others. Last point here, it's, people may have suggestions in the Q&A. Are there structural changes? Are there things that we should do? So should we be teaching emotion and emotional tools more in the first year, more in the negotiation? How should we do that? Broader implications. So I'm going to move from the study itself, how it could affect negotiation, to these broader societal implications. So implication number one, we know that there's a lot of inefficiency in negotiation. We know from meta-analyses, and most of you probably know, we're mediators yourselves, that often there's a lot of value that's left on the table. In research studies that are done among psychology and business school students, more than half the time, people don't even realize if someone wants exactly the same thing. So there's a lot of inefficiency in negotiation from a money point of view. But there's also a lot of inefficiency in negotiation from a psychological point of view. Many people dislike negotiation. So I've talked a lot about Stanford, which is south of us. So now east of us at Berkeley Business School, when people were asked, what do you think of? What words describe negotiation? One set of people that differ by a certain demographic characteristic listed game, competition, fun, conquest. The other group of people of a different demographic, they listed fear, cheating, sadness, anxiety. And the difference was one group of people were disproportionately men and one group of people were disproportionately women. We know from other research, many people don't like negotiation at all. It's why so-called no-haggle pricing is so popular with many people. So hopefully, one of the broader implications of this research is that by teaching in negotiation emotional skills such as optimism and ways of finding the candy lesson for yourself, this will both increase the efficiency in terms of money, right? People do better for themselves and to some extent better for efficiency, the joint gains, and the people will also be happier. There's also this performance gap. I'm gonna say this is very controversial and a lot of my colleagues disagree about how to teach this, independently of what people think of the research's validity. And I totally respect those views. But I'm gonna talk a little bit about that. So we know from a bunch of research, and again, there are some people who disagree with the research, is that in at least 3 sets of cases, people from certain groups get worse results even when they negotiate the same way. So car prices, people who are Black do worse in terms of car sales, in terms of salary negotiations, and there's some disagreements recently by Linda Cray across the Bay at Berkeley Business School about this, Haas Business School rather, which is at Berkeley. She thinks this has changed over time, but there's a lot of research in the book, Women Don't Ask, which you'll see on the slide here, that shows that women actually do worse in negotiations, much worse. And when I say that's not that women negotiate worse, but the results are worse. Same thing involving Blacks, negotiating for car sales. And also research shows that people who are either just same-sex applicants, they might not be romantically involved, or they identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, they actually pay significantly higher mortgage rates across the country. So why might this be? So one pathway, I think, is that people do worse at negotiation because there's actually discrimination. So clearly that's true from some of the research. It's intentional discrimination by people selling cars or by banks that are giving loans. But some of it may be because people do badly according to what people at Stanford call stereotype threat. If one thinks that people like oneself are not going to do well, then one does not do as well. And so in research at Berkeley, when people were told at Berkeley Business School in one classroom, hey, negotiation involves being tough and threatening people and sticking with things, men did better. No, it didn't mention that. And then in the other classroom where people were told it was about being emotional and relationships and empathy, women did better and men did worse. So part of my hope for spreading this research about optimism is that it'll close that performance gap in part. It won't completely close it because discrimination is clearly part of what explains this. And in a similar way, the related research they have that shows that optimism predicts first-year class rank, that would perhaps reduce stereotype threat in law schools, where people might, instead of thinking, oh, I'm not going to do so well, my LSATs are bad, people might instead think, oh, I'm a little bit older, I had difficulties in my life, I didn't score as well on the LSAT, but I overcame obstacles. Oh, what do you know? I'll probably do well in law school. So that's the second implication. Third is about admissions and hiring. So even though it's not a great statistical predictor, it's generally better than anything else, undergraduate GPA and LSAT. So what we found in our research was, I'm not going to display all of this here, but in a companion piece, what we found was optimism as we've defined in the research, did two things. Optimism did just as well as GPA or LSAT. Wow, so you could look at which people overcame obstacles. There's a picture of our law school here. You see Law SF in the building that I'm physically now in. And it turns out we have had for a while a legal education opportunity program that's consistent with this. People are admitted based on optimism, their ability to actually overcome obstacles. The second thing we found in this research, which I'm talking more in the question and answers about, the second thing we found was optimism predicted how well people did compared to their GPA and LSAT. So it's people who are more optimistic outperformed their predictions from the GPA and LSAT. Those who thought they couldn't overcome obstacles, the opposite, right? Final broad implication, the mental health crisis. We know from our own study at University of Miami that 40% of the people at University of Miami in the year we tested had clinically significant anxiety levels at the beginning of the first year. At the end of the first year, it was 49%. Right? We know that the rates of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse are high in law students and in lawyers and also in judges. And yet, many people avoid treatment for totally understandable reasons. Some of those understandable reasons are cultural. Certain cultures do not favor the traditional approaches to mental health, which include therapy and group therapy, for example. And then we also know that some people may avoid therapy because there's very real financial and other stigmas against it. So in Florida, I mediated a case involving how people are treated by the bar if they say that they're depressed. So at the time it was done, people who'd ever seen a therapist, this was in 1995, people who'd ever seen a therapist, instead of being able to get admitted to the bar in 2 months, it took them at least a year. If they'd seen a therapist for any reason at all. And after litigation, the delay was limited to people who had had only certain types of diagnoses. We might think that's not that bad, except one of those diagnoses was simply depression. So one reason why people avoid mental health treatment are these very understandable, palpable obstacles that get thrown in their way. So the idea of efficient emotion, to the extent that it's adopted, is that it justifies introducing into the first year curriculum and into negotiation classes some type of awareness of mental health and some mental health skills, including but not limited to optimism and different types of mindful self-compassion or meditation. So to conclude, the phrase that I like to use is that this justifies fluoride for mental health. So we can't expect that my students meditating for 10 minutes every week is going to do the same thing as if what people did was individual therapy or other interventions. But like fluoride, if there's fluoride in the water, it will help out some people and reduce cavities. And so building something into the curriculum and something into negotiation won't just mean that people will negotiate better for themselves and their clients, but also feel better for themselves. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And I look forward to hearing questions from people here. And I know we've got a lot of distinguished people on the Zoom in addition to my sister. Again, if you were drinking every time I mentioned my sister, you should definitely not be driving the next 24 hours or so. Let me start off with questions in the room, if anyone has one, and I'll just repeat the question if anyone has one. Questions or comments or suggestions. You seem to be raising your hand over there. Yes.
Just a question based on my own personal experience as a Hastings alumnus. One of the stressors was a perception, let's say the Career Services Office only catered to the students who were already in the top echelon of their classes. And I had heard secondhand the then Career Services Director say to a student who was consulting with her, well, if you're in the top 10% of the class, you have an embarrassment of riches. And she, I guess, attempted to make a joke and saying, if you're not in the top 10%, then you're an embarrassment.
Oh my goodness, wow. And this is what year was this?
I graduated in 2000.
So 20 years ago, just to repeat the observation, the person who was director of career services then said, if you're in the top 10%, you have an embarrassment of riches. And if you're not in the top 10%, thinking it was a joke, perhaps, said, then you're just an embarrassment. Right, right. That's, I will say that, you know, one of the things that I am doing now is planning on teaching part of this through the Office of Career Services. And what we'll be doing is teaching emotional skills and also things that draw in more people. So do a lot of research on how to tell if people are lying, which people love more than meditation and pay more than meditation. So we'll be inviting alums such as yourself to attend, donors to attend, general counsel who are clients of mine to attend, and law students to attend. And the idea is to create a mixer where people will have a different opportunity to meet and to network rather than just these formal interviews where people are just looking at this very narrow sense of things. I'm very sorry that you had to go through that. And I know that I wasn't here 20 years ago, so I'm not sure who that was, if they stayed on. But I know that our current career services office really tries to address the full spectrum of students here. And yeah, on behalf of the school, I apologize. I apologize for that. Yes, yes, my friend in the back.
Years ago, I worked in CGRS, and much of the reason I wanted to come today was this is so applicable in other areas. And two areas that have come up recently, I have a student in Ukraine that I'm coaching with English and other skills. And the two things that have come up are dealing with cultural differences, and of course, having to negotiate on Zoom, where you lose so much of the body language. That's
right. So the comment is by my friend who used to attend these wonderful meditation sessions that were run by Michael Stonebreaker, who was the former deputy director of student services. So the two comments are that a lot of this applies to other negotiations, and in particular, that there can be importance for cultural differences was number one, and second was Zoom. So yeah, let me address those in reverse order. So Zoom's fantastic in certain ways. Zoom is fantastic. As much of what I teach about emotion recognition is the most scientifically supported way to read emotions in others and across cultures are facial expressions of emotion. They are universal expressions. There was a debate 30 or 40 years ago between Margaret Mead, a very famous anthropologist, who believed that emotions are different in different cultures. And on the other side was my mentor and close friend and business partner, Paul Ekman, previously at UCSF and the advisor to the TV show Lie to Me, which is based on his life, as well as Inside Out, the popular Disney movie. So they had it out. And the answer after decades is crystal clear. Emotions are not cultural. Emotions show up on the face in exactly the same way in every culture ever studied, and it can be taught. The triggers are cultural, right? There are cultural differences with negotiation. Americans stereotypically negotiate too quickly and are not relationship oriented enough. In many cultures within the United States and business cultures, it's not okay to say to someone, what's your bottom line? But many people ask that anyway, offending other people. So Zoom, the beauty of Zoom is we can really zero in on the face. You're right, we do lose the body language. It turns out the body language from the point of view of reading emotion as well as reading truthfulness and deception is not super fertile. So you don't really lose that much there, but what you do gain is you really see people's face. And I actually have a piece that I'm revising for publication now that is on the upside of Zoom for lie detection and inclusion. So that's a really great two sets of questions. Do we have anyone on Zoom who has their hand up?
I don't see it.
No Zoom questions. Michael, yes.
So you mentioned that the kind of optimism that you were measuring can be coached.
Yes.
So you had measured this you said you measured that at the very beginning of the class and then did a mild emotional measurement upon their final negotiation. So was that to show a progression from that initial point to this final examination of how their optimism perhaps progressed?
Oh,
Why is this-
that's a great question. And when I do the study again, I should check that out. Yeah, no, it wasn't. No, so we only measured optimism at the beginning of the semester, and we actually didn't teach it in that class. So we only measured at the beginning. So that's actually a great suggestion for what we could do, which is sort of two important points. So yes, we do know that certain types of optimism can be taught. I haven't reviewed the literature recently on how much it's been shown that Chuck Carver's version of optimism, the other version of optimism, that things will just turn out okay, that turns out to be something that can be taught. And that was developed by Marty Seligman, the founders of positive psychology. So it's worth testing out, can we really increase people's sense that they could overcome obstacles? And two, if we do that, will that second measure of optimism turn out to predict the results as well? Because there's always a danger in doing research based on self-report measures that people figure out, oh, the correct answer is I could overcome obstacles, right? And then they say that they can do it, but it's not really true. So maybe we really want to see, is it the beginning of the semester that predicts or the end? Yeah, that's a really great question. And Karen, we have two people on Zoom. And I don't know how to get them to talk. How do we do
They
that?
just unmute themselves.
Oh.
Yeah.
Whoever wants to talk, you can unmute yourself. Dana, you can unmute yourself. Oh, right, I can see people's names are up there. That's fantastic.
All right, there. I think I did it. Thank you so much, Clark, for all of this interesting information. I think, from the standpoint of a mediator, we tried to create an atmosphere in which there are more positive emotions. It's challenging, so I'm interested in hearing more about that. But my question was related to how does one actually teach optimism, either form, and how do you do that in the classroom? I think that would be really an interesting thing to know. And then if you've thought about it, how does that happen in the short period of time that we have parties in mediation so that they can negotiate more effectively?
Right, that's a great question. So in terms of how we do it when there's a longer amount of time, Marty Seligman has a study which is cited in the article that I wrote on the lawyer, negotiator's mood scientist. So he did a study at the University of Pennsylvania where he teaches, and it was for undergraduates, and it was a course that took place, if I'm remembering correctly, their first year. And so he was able to show that during that course, people could increase their degree of optimism. But I can't remember off the top of my head is if the people who took that course ended up doing better in their grades from that. So then we get to the question of how could we teach this, and how can you do this as a mediator? Those of you, by the way, Dana's very modest. Dana's the former chief mediator for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and a thriving mediator in the Bay Area, and has written about bias involving people based on age in mediation and other kinds of ways to include. So I think part of what one does in the approach is to remind people of their past successes. And so this is based on cognitive behavioral therapy, that people might have a limiting belief that I never can overcome obstacles. And then you ask people, and you can do this even just as a mediator, well, I know you say that you never overcome obstacles. Can you ever think of a single time when you overcame an obstacle? And most people will be able to come up with that. And then you can maybe get them to think of another example and ask, well, how did you do that? So that's one way of doing it, one simple technique. The other is to ask people, and this comes from the field of motivational interviewing, is to ask people, if you imagined you were able to overcome an obstacle, so you feel that you can't assert yourself in mediation, this is unbearable. I have a student who discussed in the state mediation last semester And she was involved in it as a party, and she thought that the whole process was simply unbearable to her. And she simply wanted it to end. So if you're coaching someone, you're the mediator in caucus, the person says, I just want this to be over. You can ask the person, well, when you've wanted things to be over in the past, what has worked? What has worked for you? If you can imagine that you make it through this mediation, instead of accepting this first offer now, you hold out, as most people do, until the end of the day. And you end up with more money for yourself and for those you love. How would you have done that? So that's a technique for motivational interviewing. Yeah, those are great. Yeah, those are great questions. And I think one of the goals, I think, institutionally for a negotiation center is to try to develop snippets on video or otherwise that are usable and scalable. So we can have teaching resources that address that simple question, or that address the wonderful comment by David Hoffman about Len Riskin's book about how mediators could apply that. So we can just edit out that 5 minutes and push that out to mediators like yourself and people who teach negotiation and mediation. And I think David is actually the next person with their hand up.
Yes. Hi, Clark. Fabulous talk. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's so great to see you.
Well, good to see you as well. And plus the other very experienced people like Dana, Gary, Jay, others here in the room. So I have a comment and a question. The comment has to do with the mental health fluoride treatments that you mentioned, which it seems like a great idea for law students. Some of us do encounter, I teach law students, so I have an opportunity to apply some fluoride from time to time. But for people who are not teaching law students, my comment is that I think all of us have a responsibility to apply fluoride by mentioning to people in appropriate settings and where we feel safe doing so. If we see a therapist, which I do, or have had challenges with anxiety or depression or other conditions over the years, I think to reduce the stigma, not just in the legal world, but in our world generally, about mental health challenges is a super important public health challenge and contribution that we can all make in our whatever corners of the world we operate in. My question, and I'd be interested if you want to respond to that, or but my question has to do with priming. There are all kinds of interesting. I'm sorry, Clark. What were you saying?
Oh no, I'm agreeing with you. Priming, right? Priming and research.
Right. So I'm curious if you have some, in addition to things you've talked about, some priming studies that we workaday mediators can put into practice tomorrow morning.
On the priming, what I would say is that there are a number of these mood induction studies which look at what are the kinds of things in general, right? In general, that induce positive mood. So we know that there are certain types of music that in general induce positive mood. We know that there are certain types of scents that in general induce positive mood. We know that chocolate in general induces positive mood. And I think what would be maybe useful for me to push out, and I'm so glad this is recorded so I don't have to write this down right now, would be a longer answer to your question, but not so long that people couldn't just listen to it in 3 minutes, right? To list what are the mood interventions that mediators could use that, based on research in other areas, really do prime, whether it's positive emotion like happiness, or prime people's ability to overcome obstacles. That's a great question. I commit to doing that by the end of the summer and pushing it out. And I'd love to get your feedback on that when I send you the working part of that. The first part I think is super important. Normalizing two things: normalizing mental health challenges and normalizing seeking help for mental health challenges. I find that that's very, very, very rare in law schools. There's an article by a professor in the Journal of Legal Education who talks about coming out with having depression and the challenges. Institutionally, it's very hard as well. I have a colleague in legal academia who had severe depression and needed an extension for a year. He was legally entitled to based on the FMLA and law school. And yet, people treated the person badly. They were initially denied tenure after that. So I think law schools do still, the legal person still is not a place where people can easily talk about depression, just as in our society where it's hard, but there are senators who have done that relatively recently, and a judge, if I'm remembering correctly, profiled the New York Times. I talk about that with my students. I've had depression on and off since I was 12, and I've tried a variety of things for that. So I think it's important to point that out and to give people resources for that. So I think that's great. So I encourage people to do that, and especially for my colleagues who are not tenured or who have don't have tenure-like protections. I think it's challenging. It's heroic when people can address that. And one other person has a question whose name I can't quite see due to my poor eyesight.
Kara
here.
McCarthy.
So Kara McCarthy, if you could unmute and ask a question, that would be great.
Yeah. Hi, sorry, I'm all blurry. I'm not sure why. Thank you so much. This was an excellent presentation. And I have a couple of comments, a little bit jumping off of David's, as well as a question. I teach as an adjunct. I was teaching at Quinnipiac Law School, a negotiation clinic, where we really integrated the well-being aspects into the curriculum, and sort of going on that, how do you put the fluoride in? Just some tools that we use that not necessarily so focused on the optimism, which I really do like, that I've been seeing as I teach more, the need for that. But we do like regular check-ins. I mean, the clinic is small, and then we have a prerequisite course, but we do check-ins with the students. And really that is to just see how they are as a whole person, right? We ask them how they are physically, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, really sort of based on sort of this 6 pathways, the pathways that the Institute for Wellbeing and Law have looked at for lawyers. But in addition to that, as you said, sort of like the 10 minutes of meditation or a small meditation doesn't necessarily do that. We've have a program, a wellbeing mentorship program, that the students meet once a week with wellbeing mentors, and I started this way, which are generally attorneys, either practicing or no longer practicing, but in the wellbeing space, but have some expertise. Some who are very open about their struggles and battles with mental health issues, and they meet and they talk about these topics and how they integrate and how they can use them, right, with the skills that we're trying to teach in terms of negotiating as well as mediation. And I think the storytelling aspect, I did a presentation for IWIL recently on, how storytelling can really be a great tool for that, to normalize it. But also we teach students, it's a really great communication skill on mediating and negotiating, right? You've got to really be active listening, and you often have to retell your stories, your clients' stories, as well as sort of bridging the gap, right? Trying to find sometimes where that shared humanity is in those conflict situations. So I just offer that as, so one way that we've done it is hard, right? In the setting itself of the course is necessarily to bring that in, but there are those small ways, like you said, like a gratitude practice in the beginning of class or the meditation. But we have found, and the students overall have really, this is just sort of anecdotal. We haven't done any real great ways to measure the effect of the wellbeing program. We're trying to do surveys, but you might know students and surveys. But they tend to say, at least in their journals and outside of that they really found it such a really beneficial and helpful experience to be able to really explore those outside of the setting where when you're the professor, you don't, you know, they see you in a different way versus that mentor. So that's just something that I offer. And my question is, have you seen any sort of change in students over the course of your teaching? I'm a relatively newer at this. I'm now teaching well-being and mindfulness at Seton Hall. But have you seen any, I guess, more students more receptive to these approaches and to how emotions are, you know, not soft skills, and are actually, you know, kind of more essential skills, I would argue, in these settings, in these negotiation and mediation. And thank you for this amazing presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. That was, well, I've been teaching since 1995, and I was on the job market in 1994. So I think it's officially 30 years that I've been giving talks like this. And I've never had more useful comments, including yours. And I would love to follow up with you really soon, like this week, to find out more about that mentorship program. That's great. That's really great, because that's something that's very scalable. And it's also, my students were talking with me as they asked them for help. Well, how can I implement these ideas? And they thought, well, it should be something that's voluntary, but there's an incentive. And so having a mentor in the legal profession, the incentive might be, yes, they're helpful with wellness, but they're also maybe helpful with their careers and job opportunities. So that's really great. To answer your question about how things have changed, I think there have been two big changes. Number one is, my students are much more anxious than they ever were. My students are much more anxious than they ever were. And my students are much more self-critical than they ever were. And I think that partly represents changes in our overall society, partly represents changes in the legal profession. And may also represent partly that I'm here in the Bay Area rather than in Miami. So I think my students have become much more anxious. In terms of being open to things, I would say that I've been pretty lucky teaching at University of Miami and UT Law SF. The people are really very open to these kinds of approaches. Having said that, there was, as my friend knows from when we started a meditation group, there used to be maybe 30 to 60 students at our law school come every week for our meditation programs. And when I tried to revive that, there were not as many people coming. So I think there's a lot of competition for people's time, and it's a bit of a challenge to figure out how to get people to invest in it. And that's why I think it's very important to insert this fluoride for mental health into places that are already required of students. One of them are the popular negotiation classes. First year might be another possibility. So that is really great. Oh, and I see we're 2 minutes over time. And although I love teaching UC Law SF, we have like no real estate at all. So I'm going to call time for now. And anybody wants to follow up, I would love that. And I'd love to talk to you more about that in your program there. Thank you so much, David. Thank you to my friends and my sister. Again, if you were doing the drinking game, don't drive if you were doing that every time I mention my sister's name. Thank you, Meredith, for attending. Thank all of you who are live. There's so much stuff at doing all